Okay, Patrick, let's start with our first sticky note, which is the world melting down? My gosh, there's so much to talk about, Patrick. Let's start by kind of just chatting about the general macroeconomic update, kind of a global view of what's happening, because there's a lot coming at people right now. And I got to say, in many ways, the market is at a standstill. And I think it has a lot to do with what's going on kind of geopolitically, macroeconomically throughout the world. This is much bigger than just what's happening, in people's worldview. It has a lot to do with how they're feeling right now, and a lot of people are feeling like, I'm just going to pump the brakes for a little bit.
Well, let's face it, it's hard to have confidence in a world where we're hearing a lot about the wars, whether it be Israel, Hamas, you look at Ukraine and Russia, that seems to have come off the discussion table. What's going on, China, Taiwan, like there is literally a seemingly global war about to happen. It could be tomorrow, this afternoon. So it depends on what you're listening to. For most of our listeners who are a little more sophisticated in how they kind of filter their news, they're not listening to mainstream media because a lot of this isn't on mainstream media. But having said that, there is an underlying current of just when is this world coming to an end, given what's happening. I mean, supply chain breakdowns, and now the Middle East is involved, Iran. I mean, there's so much coming at people that we're seeing it also, by the way, and we'll share a chart a little later on today, but around the consumer confidence, and people have quit spending money or are quitting spending money. And that, in fact, has that downward spiral effect of slowing down the economy. Now, on one side of it, that's great. On the other side of it, it's not so good. But let's just keep focused on what the biggest issue right now is, and that is the global macro. Everybody's operating on top of that at some level. So forget about what's happening in your city, in your province, nationally. Just think about what's happening globally, and people are going, what the heck do I do? And they're just frozen with, I don't know where to go and I don't know what to do. That's my view of what I'm seeing and hearing.
Yeah, I would kind of rate this market right now, Patrick, as a bit of a hibernation market. People are just hibernating. I'm even seeing it in the rental market where people are just, and I was talking to my leasing manager literally 2 days about this, because we've been decreasing the prices of some of our apartments by $50, by $100, by $150. Some that used to rent for $2,300 now is $2,150. So, and I'm asking why, and I said to her, is it because there's much more supply on the market and we're competing with that supply? And she said, no, it's nothing to do with that. Right now, there's still a lack of supply, but there's just not a lot of demand like there was. People are just hibernating. They're saying, you know what? I'm going to wait to move until the spring. I'm going to renew my lease for another year. I'm just going to chill out. And people are kind of hunkering down. That's what I'm seeing in general, Patrick. In the rental market, I'm also seeing it in the resale market, because I got some properties that I'm trying to sell right now. And stuff's just not moving. There's just not a lot of activity because not a lot of people looking. And people are just, that's why I call it right now, we're kind of in a hibernation phase. And how long it's going to last, I don't know. But I hope it doesn't last very long, because I don't like these kinds of sideways market. There's lots of ways to make money on an uptrend. There's lots of ways to make money on a downtrend. There's lots of things to do, people to help, solutions to provide. But sideways markets, they're kind of boring.
Well, they're boring, and I think it is going to stay this way for a while, and that's not to be the doom and gloomer, but that's just to really shine a light on what is. Because when we start to create a thesis around it, then we can start making decisions based on what we believe will happen. I happen to believe this is going to go sideways for a lot longer and probably even downturn a bit. Back to the renters, though, JG, it's interesting that I was talking to a friend of mine who has, I don't know, $2,500 doors under management, and right across primarily Alberta, but also into British Columbia. He is saying that as much as there is demand for rental units, what he's being challenged with is the financial position tenants are in. So we talk about affordability, being able to qualify for a mortgage, having a down payment. He's seeing more and more where tenants are not really qualifying. They're in financial distress because their income isn't actually in alignment with the cost of rent. So we're hitting that affordability ceiling when it comes to the rents that are happening out there, and people are underwater. Right now, of course, in the news, what's the big conversation? I mean, there's lots of it, but one of the things that's happening right now is Tiff Macklem actually came out and said taxes are a big issue. That carbon tax is a big issue. So that's all to say this is that people's disposable income is getting eaten up with the rising costs. And I throw the taxflation in there because that's something that I beat that drum on so many times. Well, now finally, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, comes out and goes, yeah, that's a problem. It is actually causing an inflation problem. So all to say that our tenants are now having less disposable income, less ability to qualify as a tenant even. So that's part of what I think you're even experiencing.
Yeah, and also Tiff Macklem also came out recently and said that they could cut rates before inflation reaches its target, which is that, and you talked about this, Patrick, and I think you were accurate, which is, and we'll see how it plays out when we talk about GDP. But this is where stagflation comes in, where you have inflation that isn't coming down as fast as they want, but the economy is crashing faster than they want, and as a result, they got to stimulate that economy. And it's a hell of a dance that they've had to play, walk a fairly tight rope from my perspective in the last 18 months. It hasn't been easy, the decisions they've had to make. I think the decisions they're about to make are going to be even more difficult because of this. And it's funny, this to me, Tiff Macklem coming out and saying this is an indication of kind of, this is what they do. They float the narrative out there in the media, see how it lands, see if they can stimulate some activity with their narrative. And then if they can, great. And if they can't, then they make different decisions. Kind of fascinating. I find it very, very fascinating because literally in the same week, you had Tiff Macklem saying, no, we'll continue to raise rates if we need to. And then literally 3-4 days later, he comes out, or I think it was 7 days later, comes out and says, well, we could cut rates before we hit our inflation target. That's the push and pull happening right now. First quarter 2024, Patrick prediction, they're going to cut. That's what I just heard.
I can make that make sense. First quarter, and again, probably in the first half.
First quarter, first half. 2 cuts. I just heard another Patrick prediction. Yeah. 2 cuts in the first half.
I'll be brave. Well, and let's put it this way. I mean, there's not a word that comes out of his mouth that isn't intentional. That's how they're designed. Is actually how they have
I thought you were going to say, Patrick, there isn't a word that comes out of his mouth that I believe. I thought that's what you were going to say.
Well, that's the truth, right? But that's the other side of it. I also believe that. The point is, it's very intentional. So a lot of what he's doing is saber rattling. He's literally keeping people confused and uncertain so that they don't build up this confidence. His fear is that if he would indicate that they might drop rates or they're going to drop rates, he has to balance that out, because as soon as he gives that level of optimism, he's afraid that the economy is going to take off again and they're going to have this whole issue around housing. Now, we keep talking about housing, but let's go back to this kind of where we entered this whole conversation. Let's look at the global macro. What are people operating on top of? What's happening to consumer confidence? Where are people getting their information from? And then to your point, they're just hunkering down. They're sitting on the couch, or they're not doing much. They're not spending money. They're hanging on to what they have for fear of losing a job, perhaps, for the actual reality of the cost of living that they're trying to make work. And so we have these problems that are really out of our control. Interest rates are not going to change what happens in any number of the wars that we have going on, any number of the supply chains that we got going on. We caught a small break on oil prices. You know, I follow that really closely. They've come down a little bit. Fill up your tank while you can, because there is going to be, in my view of the world, I think we're going to see a big spike in oil in the very near term, given what's happening with Middle East and some of the decisions that are being made. So,
hey, I just had a good idea, Patrick. We should track every time we do a show, whether your last prediction came true or not yet, because the last show you said oil prices were going to go up. They didn't. They went down. So it'd be like a -1 for Patrick.
JG. Okay, JG, you're pushing my buttons. You're pushing my buttons. Jamie, our producer, will pull it up. What I said is it will ultimately rise into the first quarter of 2024. And I said along the way, it's going to go up and down a little bit. You're going to see it's not a straight line up. It never is. So don't put words in my mouth.
That must be a scientific prediction. But I'm just saying we should do an over-under. We should do an over-under. +1, -1. And
fine. I'm happy to do that. Happy to do that.
But Patrick, I'm showing the slide now. I want people to see that Canadians, as the slide puts it, Canadians feeling blue. Sentiment hasn't been this low since the beginning of COVID, as well as the great financial crisis. We'll see when this starts to turn. And you're absolutely right that this is a leading indicator, because this will turn before we see the turn in GDP, before we see the turn in pricing, before we see the turn in the statistics. We will definitely see the turn here. So far, it's not turning, at least from what we've seen as of where when this came out, which I believe was at the end of September, meaning a month
Yeah.
ago.
And by the way, small business SMEs are feeling exactly the same way. So this goes back to when we look into the leading indicators. If you've got both the consumer keeping their hands in their pockets and you've got small businesses not feeling optimistic, of course, then businesses are not, in fact, growing. They're not hiring. They're slowing things down. They're not buying as much inventory to hedge on their bet. They're not prepared to borrow any money at these rates. This is exactly what the intention of the Bank of Canada was, in fact, to slow the economy down with the rising interest rates. So
yeah, also this chart I just want to show, Patrick, and then you can wrap it up, is that businesses though are still expecting inflation to trend for 3% annually or more over the next 2 years. So there's still an expectation. People, especially businesses, are still seeing that some prices are rising, albeit there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence I'm seeing of prices coming down quite rapidly in some, construction materials, stuff like that. The places where I operate, it's just interesting. But this is again, back to expectations. Often expectations become reality, Patrick, which why we think this chart's kind of interesting.
100%. So when we look at business, these are leading indicators that we're looking at, the expectations, and everybody just starts to get really guarded. And that's what happens with an economy that makes it slow down.
What a fantastic segment, Patrick. Not only did we find out, wow, the world may be coming to an end, we came up with a fantastic idea of the Patrick Over Under game show, which I'm going to be launching shortly.
Yeah, do it. If you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.
If you want to see more stuff like this, click here. If you want to see the entire show, click there.